Jimmy Carter was president the last time inflation was this high.
We wanted to gain a better understanding of how the current inflation problems compare to those 4 decades ago. So we reached out to an economics expert who personally experienced the inflation crisis of the early 1980s.
This morning, we have a live interview with Dr. Tom Miller, Jr., a professor of finance at Mississippi State University.
Good morning, Dr. Miller. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Appreciate having you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you.
Well, you graduated with a master's degree in economics in 1979. So, of course, you personally experienced the high levels of inflation that occurred around 1980. So, first question, how do you think the current inflation compares to what the country went through in the late 70s and early 80s?
Well, I would say that at the late 70s, that was kind of the tail end of the inflation that started earlier in the 70s. So I think we're probably at the beginning of the inflationary cycle, not at the end right now.
And is the United States starting to see economic crisis happen more frequently? You know, just to break it down, there were 40 years between the end of the Great Depression and the 1970 inflation crisis, 28 years between the 1980 inflation crisis and the 2008 recession, and then only 14 years between then and the current inflation crisis.
That's a really interesting question. I think that the speed of the way we transmit information and news in the markets these days is much faster, and so we can, in fact, see bigger swings, more volatility because of that.
Yeah.
And also, I think we've seen a growth of interfering, having the government try to do programs more rapidly than before. This time we're just coming at the end of the COVID crisis, for example, here in Mississippi and across the country. So, this is a different time than it was in the late 80s. We didn't even have the internet. There's no way we could do this interview back in 1979.
Right.
True. So now, as far as the public's response and attitude towards this, how do you feel the public's attitude about the current inflation crisis resemble that from 40 years ago? Is it the same? Is it different? And maybe the sense of urgency to get out of the crisis. What do you think?
Well, I think there's always an urge to do something about inflation. And unfortunately, I think that for most people, we have our budgets and we kind of have our own personal inflation index. What do we spend money on? If we're not buying a car, we're not buying a house, we're not quite as impacted by those type of items, but gasoline prices, food prices, etc. The thing that I fear is that we will engage in a series of price controls to curb inflation, and that will actually make things worse because it'll create shortages for people, like the gasoline shortages. If you go back and read about the gasoline shortages and the rationing attempts that we had, instead of letting the price just ration out gas, I'd much rather pay more at the pump than have to wait a half an hour or an hour to get in line to buy gasoline, for example. So I think people are always wanting to do something, and a lot of the times that's just not the way to go.
And the inflation crisis 40 years ago contributed significantly to President Jimmy Carter's re-election defeat. So do you see any political ramifications for President Joe Biden that he may have to deal with over this issue?
Well, yes. I think that voters can look at what they're paying and they think that I'm not an expert in political science, but inflation is bad news for any sitting administration.
Yeah.
Gotcha, all right.
And, we were saying in commercial break when we were talking with you that there's a lot to talk about here. So we are running out of time, and I appreciate you for joining us so early, but hopefully we can talk to you again, whether it's next week or later this week. Again, thank you so much for joining us so early.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure.